Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on all things narcissism, narcissistic related. Today's a little bit of a longer video. It's one that many have asked for. I try to make it as comprehensive as possible, but I'm sure I still miss some points, so always welcome comments and thoughts on that. But today's video is going to get at something that I actually usually talk more to professional audiences about, which is how does narcissism develop? In essence, how do people become narcissistic? Before we get to that, please welcome to this channel. If you're new, hit that subscribe button. Hit that bell if you want to get notifications whenever a new video comes up, which is every day. So let's take this question on. How do people become narcissistic? Where does this pattern that's hurting so many people come from? This is a question that comes up a lot. And I'm going to tell you this right now. I'm answering this question and making this video reluctantly. I'll tell you why. It's not because I don't want to share the information. Obviously, I'm a big believer knowledge should be shared. But I'll tell you why I'm reluctant. Sometimes what happens is once people hear these things, they hear where this personality comes from. They often feel compelled to justify the narcissist's behavior. They'll say things like, oh, now that I know why they are the way they are, I kind of feel bad for them. And I just don't want to pull away from them. And great, so then you're just signing up to put up with more of the emotional abuse and remain even more stuck. I can only ask you to please hear this as a framework that's based in theory to help you understand these patterns. And I can also only ask you, please don't use them as a justification for somebody's mistreatment of you or for narcissistic behavior or for you enduring more abuse. I can't force you to do that. I can't come to your house and say, please don't do that. You're adults. You take this information and always recognize, though, that you can learn about where these patterns come from, but you can't change them. Narcissism and narcissistic personality styles largely reflect developmental issues. Okay, so these are issues that sort of develop through childhood. The narcissistic personality that emerges in adulthood largely reflects what happened to the person as they came up through childhood into adolescence. Our personalities start to develop from the day we are born pretty steadily until our early to mid-20s. During these years, our brain's rapid phase of development goes throughout childhood and adolescence. In our mid-20s, things slow down a little bit. And I think it's safe to say that by about our mid-20s, kind of like a jello mold that stops shaking, our personalities get pretty well set. There's a little room here and there, but they get pretty well set. So let's start at the difficult end of this, okay? Narcissistic personality styles. Okay, because this is probably the most difficult explanation. Narcissistic personality styles are suggested to be a manifestation of what happens to a personality after being exposed to or adverse childhood experiences, and may be a manifestation of post-traumatic symptomatology. So children and their personalities, these are shaped through neglect, abuse, inconsistency, and in many ways that some of the patterns that are observed in narcissism are consistent with some of the patterns we see in all kinds of post-traumatic presentations. For example, after trauma, people may experience things like restricted expression of emotion, a chronic perception of threat, even impulsivity. Narcissism can also reflect a disruption in attachment. Now, secure attachment is like the gold standard. It's what we hope that everyone can have. And secure attachments are created by early attachments, early relationships with consistent and available caregivers who give the child a sense of safety within themselves and with the world, who love them, and who foster important skills like self-regulation. Narcissism is not associated with a secure attachment style, but rather with what we term anxious and avoidant attachment styles. And these result in the person never, not as a child and not as an adult, ever feeling safe in close relationships. There's always this push and pull. They're in, they're out, they're in, they're out, and a relative incapacity for deep and sustained closeness and intimacy. This is challenging because having a history of trauma and difficulties with attachment aren't always observed in people with narcissistic personality styles. In addition, people who have those patterns in childhood don't always go on to develop narcissistic personality styles. In addition, it can feel hard to set boundaries or walk away from someone who's had this history, because knowing someone's had this kind of difficult history as a child all plays upon cognitive dissonance, justifications, rationalizations, and just feeling stuck for a person in a relationship with a narcissist. But like I said, probably the bulk of people who have these attachment and trauma issues in childhood don't go on to develop narcissism. So it's not a guaranteed path. Then there is the issue of temperament. Simply put, temperament is, I don't know, for lack of a better way to say it, sort of the biological part of personality. Temperament is actually believed to be inherited and can explain why even from the very beginning of our lives, or an infant's life or a person's life, some infants are more difficult to soothe and some soothe so easily, and into childhood, while some children may simply just be more difficult, more behaviorally agitated, more attention-seeking. Temperament can be easier or more difficult. In some cases, temperament can really make things really difficult. Because a child with a difficult temperament, quite frankly, definitely is going to have a more difficult go of it. When they're babies, their mothers and fathers may be more frustrated by them. As they grow up, teachers may not like them as much. Adults may find them more difficult as children. And what does that mean? That means that child can have a relatively invalidating experience with the world on the basis of their difficult temperament. Let's face it, on the other side, kids who have easy, resilient temperaments, those kids definitely have an easier go of it. They may be the more favored child because the parent often feels like a more confident parent with them. And they just may have an easier experience of the world because they kind of go with the flow more easily. Temperament may be in part a reason why children are differentially impacted by the experiences of their childhood. And it is very likely that it's the case that a subset of adult narcissists very likely had difficult or sensitive temperaments as children. And then you could see that if they also on top of that had adverse childhood experiences or any other difficult childhood experiences, or even things like disengaged parents, and these difficult kids are more likely to have disengaged parents because the kid was more difficult. So the parent may pull away a little bit or just be more frustrated. That combination of temperament and invalidation can also raise the vulnerability for a narcissistic personality style. However, there are also other developmental pathways at play when we think about how the narcissistic personality style evolves. Some people have called the development of narcissism as being caused by simultaneous over and under indulgence of a child. These are children who are spoiled with getting maybe things, getting experiences, I don't know, like going to a theme park or something, but whose emotional worlds remain really impoverished. It's the psychological equivalent, I don't know, of only being fed junk food. If you kept eating junk food, you wouldn't be hungry, but you're not nourished. For children who are raised in this sort of over and underindulged manner, their material needs are met, but they are not taught how to be comfortable or even have with their emotions, or even have their emotions nurtured. They may even in some cases be shamed for having emotions, and they do not get to learn one of the most important things we are supposed to learn in childhood, which is self-regulation, being able to manage feelings and emotions. Now, a not insignificant proportion of narcissists may have had a narcissistic parent or parents themselves. And so certain elements of narcissism, particularly entitlement, rage, other dysregulated demonstrations of emotion, arrogance, superficiality, can all be learned through something called modeling. The child doing what he or she sees. When a child sees something, they tend to repeat it, especially if they see it repeatedly. They'll see the father who yells at the soccer coach, the mom who yells at store clerks and hotel clerks. Kid sees enough of this, and it starts to become normalized and may, not always, but may, get mirrored in adult behavior. Narcissistic parents and other parents with difficult personality styles also have really, really bad boundaries. And what they'll do is almost inject their emotions and expectations and their needs into their child all the time. A simple example of this could be when the child does express an emotion. Mommy, I feel sad. And mommy doesn't say the right answer. The right answer is, oh, honey, that's so hard. And she soothes her child, holds her child, and gives the child permission to talk about it, and even recognizes they may not be able to fix it. But what we tend to see a little bit more often in children who are at risk for developing narcissism is a parent who uses the child's emotional state as an opportunity to make it about them. The child says, Mommy, I'm sad. And a narcissistic mother could say, oh, goodness, this sad, you just made mommy sad. When you're sad, mommy's sad. Whoa, hello, what just happened? The child just learned now that their emotions are a problem. The child doesn't want to have the responsibility for making mommy sad. So now the child says, I'm sad, and now mommy just made it about her. Not only do they start negating and avoid sharing their emotions, but they may not even fully understand where their emotions end and the emotions of other people begin. And in adulthood, where we see this happen for narcissistic individuals, this is manifested as the narcissist, again, not seeing that difference between them and others, not fully understanding how they impact other people, or simply just not having any understanding of their inner world. The example I gave you also shows us how tricky all of this is. Some of you may be thinking, damn, my parent did that to me all the time, and now I'm actually not narcissistic, but I waste a lot of time trying to babysit other people's emotions and worry about everyone else's emotions. See, that's what I'm saying. There's no guaranteed singular pathways. That's where temperament and all of these other factors come getting mixed up. None of this is a perfect science. That's part of the struggle. And so, yeah, you could have had a parent like this and be whatever the opposite of narcissism is. So we end up having to sort of back construct these narratives. If we go to some of the work, the theoretical work by someone named Winnicott, he calls this whole experience the false self, the parent sort of sticking their self into the child. And the child then internalizes the parent's needs over their own. And this false self in the narcissist has sort of run amok. And that's where they've sort of internalized this parent, and then they no longer are aware of others. Conditional love is a phenomenon that many children are subjected to. The idea of usually it starts with a parent saying, I love you if, or I love you when, or I only love you if. Fully actualized growth in a human being requires unconditional regard. A parent saying, I love you. Done. It doesn't mean the parent likes everything you do, but it does mean that the parent loves the child and doesn't confuse the whole child with the child's behavior. A healthy parent would apply appropriate consequences so the child learns appropriate behavior, but the child knows they're loved, so they feel safe. The validation seeking of narcissists is in part very much a byproduct of getting almost only conditional love. I love you if you get a trophy. I love you when you win. And this is really pronounced for parents that I call the performing pony style of parenting. The parents who validate the child only when the child performs, only when the child wins. These are the parents who are front and center, cheering the child on. When the kid gets the trophy, when the kid scores the winning touchdown, when the kid is the number one in the ballet performance or the science fair or the spelling bee or is helping in the family business. Yeah, that's my kid. Look at them. Yes, of course it's good for parents to be proud. I sit in the front row if my kid's in a show too. But these kids are winning or excelling or doing what the parent needs. The parent, of course, is nowhere to be found when that kid isn't doing what the parent wants them to be. It's all very conditional. And again, I also know some of you who are watching this are thinking again, damn, my parents never showed up to anything. It would have been nice to have even had conditional love from them, like that they even knew I existed. And I get that. It sucks all around. Parents should just love their kids. And if they show up and it's conditional, then you know that whatever love you're getting is about what you bring to the table. That's not a nice feeling for a child. If they don't show up at all, you can believe you aren't even worthy of any regard, not even an hour of their time to show up at your soccer game. And as we go deeper into the era of helicopter parents and bubble wrap parents, parents who overprotect their children and shield them from everything, that too can be a risk for bringing upon narcissistic tendencies that will sort of start in childhood, but then boom, show up in adulthood. Many parents make the huge error of trying to shield their children from disappointment. Childhood is where we are supposed to learn from the disappointments, big and small. The lost soccer game, the bad grade, the not being invited to a birthday party, the lost pet, not getting onto the team or into the play. So many parents view their children as performative extensions of themselves that the parents themselves can't stand the disappointment that their child is going through and try to shield everyone from it. And these are also the entitled parents that try to stack the deck so their child doesn't experience any disappointment. They may strong-arm the schools, they may strong-arm the coaches and the teachers and buy a new pet right away, right after the one pet gets sick and dies, talking smack about the kid who didn't invite you to the birthday party. It's tempting. Gosh, it is tempting to fix things for a kid, but it does a child absolutely no favors. Childhood is the time when a child must learn to regulate disappointment in a safe, loving space. But we know one thing, obviously, what happens to narcissists is that they don't do disappointment. And when they are disappointed, or basically just don't get their way, their adult tantrums can put a 3-year-old to shame. In a generation of parents, as this generation has been, trying to compensate for what their parents got wrong, overprotecting a child from reality and from disappointment can put them at risk, put that child at risk for going on to become a relatively dysregulated adult and for being much more stress reactive as adults, both of which are patterns we see in narcissism. There's definitely an emotionally stunted quality to the narcissistic personality. For example, the narcissistic personality is somebody who, at the age of 50, they continue to function and value things in the same way as we typically see about an adolescent. And they still tantrum like a 3-year-old. They look like adults. They often have jobs like adults. They have stuff like adults. But their inner worlds can often remain quite undeveloped, which actually makes sense because these different kinds of developmental experiences I've been talking about, in many ways, keep them stuck. We're not done yet, though. There's more things that can lead to narcissism in adulthood. The extrinsic focus, the external focus of how we raise kids doesn't help. The phones, the gadgets, for people who can afford them, the vacations, the expensive theme park days. And when you couple that with the social media soaked and obsessed world, we're watching in front of our eyes, we're watching 17-year-olds amass vast wealth on the basis of dancing on social media. The world and the economy have changed. The world has changed, and is social media making things worse in the world of narcissism? Absolutely yes. And then when you add to that parents who have agendas for their kids about succeeding in this external space, it then becomes about the child becoming one more pathway for the parent to get validation. The child becomes a sort of ego extension for the parent. And the child goes into adulthood believing that they are the things they achieved, the trophies on the shelf, rather than valuing who they are simply as human beings. Now, everything I've described, trauma, insecure attachments, being conditionally valued, parental inconsistency, parental unavailability, only being valued for external characteristics, these are all things that could potentially foster the bedrock of narcissism, which is insecurity. Whatever fosters insecurity in a child, and that insecurity can proliferate unchecked into adulthood, places a person at risk for narcissism in adulthood. And when the person, in the face of this insecurity, develops grandiose defenses such as entitlement to protect that core insecurity, we see that evolution into narcissism. Heck, if all we did was raise safe, secure children who had parents that were mindful and present, narcissism rates would drop. That is not going to happen. I've said this a million times before, and here I say it again. Another way we maintain the development and the sustenance of narcissism is plain old enabling. While enabling may not foster it in a child, it can though if the child is very sort of spoiled. As the child gets older, for the enabled child, these patterns don't get called out, not in the child, not even in the adults. The child then sees that the adults are getting away with it. And the child themselves may not get called out for arrogance and bravado and tantrums, especially if that kid is performing, as long as they're winning games, or they're the golden child, or they're getting A's, or they're getting TikTok followers. Their parents may say, heck, your behavior is besides the point. And that's how, in adolescence and early adulthood, all those seeds set in childhood can finally get set like that Jell-O mold turning hard. Here's what we don't have from a research perspective, and I wish we did. The long-term, longitudinal developmental studies that follow children from infancy into adulthood and gather a lot of data on them so we can understand what the factors are that prospectively turn into narcissism from an infant into adulthood. Right now, the best we've got is case study research, where we write about narcissism and learn about their histories, and what we call retrospective research, which is research when we ask adults to tell us about their childhood. But not everyone remembers everything perfectly. Lots of the things I've listed, the adverse childhood events and the trauma and the conditional love and all of that, they don't result in narcissism. They can go in all kinds of different directions. People with all the things I've listed on this video may end up becoming overly empathic adults and thus become very vulnerable to narcissists. They may turn into anxious adults. They may use substances. They may develop obsessive compulsive symptomatology. They may develop post-traumatic symptoms. Those things aren't narcissism. So even this laundry list I've given you may or may not turn into narcissism. And the final piece here, and an important piece for us to kind of come to an end on, you as an adult cannot undo another adult narcissist's history unless the narcissist actually thinks something is not right. They themselves are like, yeah, no, this is not cool. Without the narcissist's self-reflection, you're not going to be the one to undo their history. Because that's the struggle, isn't it? It's the idea that we can go back and we can be that unconditionally loving parent, and we can teach them the goodness of what is inside of them, and we can break them of their superficial cycles, and we can teach them how to regulate. It doesn't work like that. That had to happen back when all of these neural pathways were getting laid down. Most of us carry wounds from childhood, and those are our own load to bear. Someone else can't fix it. A therapist can talk about it. They can't fix it. And you sure as hell can't fix it for a narcissist. These narcissistic patterns have deep, complex roots. I have no problem with you understanding these patterns and using this understanding to foster empathy and compassion. I think empathy and compassion are everything. But I do have a problem with you watching this video and taking these explanations as a way to rationalize you enduring more abuse for yourself, saying, he did have a rough childhood. You enduring abuse isn't going to change that. So I hope this clarifies a rather complex body of work. My work on this has actually led me to consider whether there may even be further subtypes of narcissism beyond the usual grandiose, malignant, covert, etc., based on their developmental histories. Someday I'll try to turn that into a series because it may illuminate things a bit further for you. But I really want to reiterate a point here. Things I talked about here: adverse childhood experiences, trauma, issues with attachment, having your parent insert their emotional world into you, that Winnicott sort of false self issue, parents with poor boundaries, parents who are not present, parents who are invalidating, all those things that can lead to narcissism. Many of you are saying, I went through these things and I'm not narcissistic. I know that. And that's absolutely true. In fact, I think it's maybe even more likely that some of these patterns would take you there. And that right there is the struggle. The very patterns that turn us into anxious adults or not feeling enough adults or vulnerable adults are the same patterns that turn into narcissism. It's probably temperament that might be a piece that gets thrown in there. Maybe the golden children are more likely to become narcissistic. The scapegoat with the same parent may turn into somebody who's much more anxious in adulthood. None of this is a perfect science. And that's why even as I present these theories to you, a lot of you wonder, where does this come from? This is where it comes from. I have no doubt that this video has raised questions for you, and please drop them in here, and we can certainly do more videos explaining this. And again, please understand all those patterns that can place a person at risk for narcissism can also place people at risk for different things. And it's for that reason, those of you who have siblings, you might have a narcissistic brother and you're not, and you have the same parents. Look at your roles that you had in the family. That too may explain why you've gone off in different directions despite being exposed to similar things. It's not a precise science. This is the challenge of psychology. That's sort of equal parts, neuroscience and wizardry. And the wizardry part is a little bit hard to sell. So thanks again for tuning in. That was a big one. That was a complicated one, but I do hope it clarified things. Bye-bye.